All right. Hi, everybody. Hope everybody is well and warm, and very happy to see you again for our fourth session on Birth of a Nation, Transitions from Moses to Monarchy. And in this session, we're going to talk about a very chaotic period in the Bible. It's the chaos before the monarchy is established in Israel. And it's otherwise known as the era of the judges and also the era of the priests. So what I have here for you is an image which shows what happened once. Can you hear me? Everybody unmute?
Yes.
Okay, mute yourselves if you can, please. So what we have here is a map of Israel, or the land of Israel, during the period of the judges. This is right after Joshua comes into the land. And if you remember what Joshua did, one of his responsibilities was to allot the land to the different tribes according to the word of God. And so you can see the 12 tribes, the land that each of the tribes was assigned. And also in this, so you'll see that in the north, there are essentially 10 tribes, and then in the south, there are 2 tribes. And those are the 10 tribes in the north that eventually disappeared. What you also see on this map are the names of the judges in the book of Judges and where they came from. And there were major and minor judges. Most people are probably familiar with Deborah. And also you may be familiar with Samson. The other ones you're probably very unfamiliar with, and each one of them has their own story. But we're not going to do any of the stories of the judges today. And I know actually that the rabbi gave a little class on Deborah earlier. So while I was thinking I might do Deborah, I think we're going to just go to the transitional parts of the book of Judges.
Annette?
Yeah.
This is a historic period, right? It's in real history.
It's a historic period, quote unquote, biblical history. There was probably some period like this, but we're reading biblical history. We're not reading history as defined by archaeology or history as defined by outside sources. Okay.
And is there any dates that are associated with that?
It's in the Iron Age, I can tell you that much. Way back.
Okay.
Way back when. Okay. So today we're going to do a quick review of session 3. We'll look at the final words of Joshua, an introduction to the book of Judges, a discussion of the horrific conclusion to the book of Judges, and the downfall of the priestly house of Eli. I'm going to warn you, as they do on the news, that there may be some images and some text that may be very disturbing. So I just want you to be aware of that before we get started. So with regard to last week, we looked at, and from a perspective of transitions, we looked at the transition from Moses to Joshua. And probably the more important features were the fact that Joshua was an aide to Moses all the way through the time in the desert, that he was one of 2 of 12 spies that brought back a positive report about the land of Canaan. So he actually saw Canaan before the people entered. That Moses did not end up going into Canaan, that God took that away from him and passed that leadership onto Joshua. And we talked about Moses's resentment of not going into Canaan, but also his ability to re-steel himself and then become a teacher to the people again. We also learned that the people respected Joshua just as they had respected Moses, that God respected Joshua, and that Joshua respected the word of the Lord. So that's pretty much, it was a peace, and most importantly, I think, we learned that it was a peaceful transition from Moses to Joshua. So let's begin this week with the final words of Joshua. Joshua reminds the people that God has been responsible to their success in conquering Canaan, and he enjoins them. You have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all those nations on your account, for it was the Lord your God who fought for you. So essentially what happens is that once the people enter into the land of Canaan, according to biblical history, okay, they fought against all the nations, and their goal was to take over everything. And God had, in fact, required of them that they have a cherem, or basically a Holocaust against all the people that lived in Canaan, all of the native Canaanites. That did not happen, though. We know that both from an archaeological standpoint and also from even from the text, where we know that there were people that were still native Canaanites who still remained on the land. But nonetheless, what we see here also is that in this part of the text, it is still God who is responsible. It is still God who's responsible for everything that happens to the nation. And Joshua adds, be most resolute to observe faithfully all that is written in the book of teaching of Moses, without ever deviating from it to the right or to the left, and without intermingling in these nations that are left among you. Do not utter the names of their gods or swear by them. Do not serve them or bow down to them, but hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day, the book of the teaching of Moses, without ever deviating from it, from right or to the left. What we learn from this, and interestingly, is that the people are now in their own land, but there are other occupants in the land, and consequently there are other gods in the land. And for the first time in many, many, many years, these people who are identified as the Israelites are in a situation where they are amongst people who worship other gods. And so it's very important on the part of Joshua to remind them that Yahweh, their God, is God, the Lord, and that there is to be no intermingling.
Oof.
Yeah.
I assume I don't remember the Bible. Evil. Deviating to the right or the left. They use the words Yamin or small.
Right.
And what do they mean in this context?
It means that all the words and all the laws and all the regulations that are in the Bible and all the warnings with respect to respecting God, that's what the people are supposed to follow.
But right or left, don't deviate at all.
Don't deviate at all. Right. Thanks for the question, Andy. Good question. Okay, let's look at the opening of the book of Judges. When Joshua dismissed the people, someone turn on their mute.
Oh.
Thank you. When Joshua dismissed the people, the Israelites went to their allotted territories and took possession of the land. The people served the Lord during the lifetime of Joshua and the lifetime of the older people who lived on after Joshua and who had witnessed all the marvelous deeds that the Lord had wrought for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at an age of 110 years, not as long as Moses lived. And all that generation were likewise gathered to their fathers. Another generation arose after them, which had not experienced the deliverance of the Lord or the deeds that he had wrought for Israel. So what we have here is a generation who had never been in Egypt, a generation whose grandparents had been in Egypt. But so it's a whole new group of people, and they're in a whole new land, and they don't have the central leader, Joshua. And so, surprise, the Israelites did what was offensive to the Lord. They worshipped the Baalim and forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the people around them, and they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord. Not surprising in biblical context. This is what people do in biblical context. They respect God, they lose God, they find God again, and particularly in the book of Judges. A basic introduction, the book of Judges follows the book of Joshua and describes the chronological period after Joshua's death and before Saul was anointed king by Samuel. Note that the last judges, who were Eli and Samuel, are introduced in the next book in the Tanakh, which is Samuel 1. The judges were essentially chieftains. They were tribal leaders and warriors who either led troops or went out on their own, but they delivered the people from the enemy. Some judges were prophets, and when we talk about prophets in the Tanakh, we're talking about people who speak the word of God. They're not necessarily prophets like we would speak about it perhaps in modern times, where there are people who are predicting something in the future. They do predict future events, but they predict future events based on the word of God. So some of the judges were prophets, some were priests, and some actually functioned in administering justice, like real judges. So I'm going to give you some highlights of an introduction to the book of Judges from the Jewish Study Bible, and which, as I've mentioned before, is an important resource for biblical scholars. And each book has its own translator and somebody who introduces the book. And in this case, the translator is Yera Amit, an Israeli biblical scholar and professor at Tel Aviv University. She writes that the main theme of the book is the inefficacy of these leaders, that is the judges, who could only save and affect their people for a limited period of time. She notes that there are two principal themes of the book. The first theme is the role of God in history. So the book of Judges describes the course of history as an interaction between God and his people. We've seen that, obviously, the interaction between God and his people up until now, but this book makes it very clear that history doesn't exist without God's interaction with his people. That is actually the biblical history. The book also looks at the type of preferred leader. She writes that the judges are not depicted as ideal leaders, and their depiction paves the way for the establishment of a more successful political institution, namely the monarchy. The ideal king could confront the people's enemies and prevent anarchy, though the book warns that the king may also be a villain. So while we're not going to talk about Israelite kings in this book, or even this week, this book is a transition book. It's a transition from pre-monarchic Israel to monarchic Israel. The book contains three parts. The first is the background to the rise of the judges, and the second describes the acts of the judges. And the two final tragic episodes, which we'll be discussing today, are the ones that create the impression that monarchy alone could end the chaotic period of the judges. Amit adds that, from a historical perspective, the book takes a particularly negative tack to the northern kingdom of Israel and suggests that it was written reflecting the shocked mood in Judah after the downfall of the northern kingdom to Assyria in 722 BCE. So going back to your question, Susan, here she's talking about when the book may have been written. The events, however, would have taken place earlier. But as we know, as Bible aficionados here, we don't know exactly when every book of the Bible was written. We, in modern scholarship, we assume it wasn't written at the time that are being described necessarily. And so the writers and the editors or redactors of the Bible may have been responding to events and may have added this book. I mean, there may have been stories about judges that were extant in the population, but they were not actually added to the Bible until later. And in this case, the theory is that her theory is that they may be related to the downfall of the Northern Kingdom. The book generally has negative portrayal of the northern tribes and accuses them of the sin of failing to drive out the local inhabitants. As I said, God had ordered a cherem, or a holocaust of the inhabitants of the land. By contrast, the book opens with a success story, by contrast to the northern tribes, regarding the tribe of Judah. In the very first chapter, Judah is depicted as having succeeded completely in driving out the local inhabitants and was faithful to the covenant with God. So this may, in fact, this book, besides being a quote unquote history, may in fact be in large part a political polemic. And that happens often in biblical text. Some scholars deny that there was a historical period of the judges and point instead to the political theme of the book, while others disagree and suggest that the time of settlement leading up to the monarchy was a decisive one in the history of the people, Israel, and in the course of which groups of settling nomads grew into an established society, developed a sense of national identity with cultural, religious heritage, and came to form the people of Israel. It's probably a combination of all of these things. The book of Judges follows a cyclical pattern. I showed you in the opening slide, the opening map, where all the different judges lived or said to have lived in the book of Judges. And each one of them was involved in a pattern of behavior that is as follows. Israel does evil in the eyes of Yahweh, or God.
Well, that's the way it comes down.
The people are given into the hands of their enemies and cry out to God.
On the screen, the whole letter.
Yahweh raises up a leader. The spirit of Yahweh comes upon the leader. The leader manages to defeat the enemy, and peace is regained. And this goes over and over again. I think there are, trying to think of how many, there are at least 7 major judges, 3 minor judges. So this book repeats itself quite often. And the book of Judges in sum is summed up by this quote. In those days when there was no king in Israel, every man did as he pleased. So you can't help, this verse is repeated at least twice in the course of the book. And so you can't help but look at this as a transitional text, and that there was some, whoever was writing it, editing it, had some some desire for a monarchy, some understanding that a monarchy was probably the best way to go. Okay, so we're going to skip all of the judges themselves, and we're going to go to chapter 19 of the book of Judges, which is a story, a narrative that is generally called the Concubine of Judea. And I'm showing you this doré woodcut, I guess it is, or etching, that shows a man with a woman on the back of an ass. She's prostrate, and basically he is the Levite, and she is his concubine. And we'll go through the story, but it is not a pretty story. And the image is copied. I just would like to give you some helpful information. The image is copied from an article entitled The Concubine of the Levite, Midrash and Agadah. And it can be found in the Jewish Women's Archive, which is an online site. And here's the connection. And it describes itself as documents in Jewish women's stories, elevates their voices, and inspires them to be ancient agents of change. I recommend it as an excellent resource, not just for women, but for the entire community. It's really an excellent, it gives you great summaries of biblical stories. It also deals with modern Jewish women and Jewish issues. And if I go into it, I'm hoping I'm going to be able to come back. But so here's what it looks like. Very easy to read, very easy to follow. So I hope you'll take a look at it. Wow, I did it. Okay. So let's start discussing the Concubine of Judea. It is one of the final narratives that's been described in the book of Judges, as I mentioned, and it's been described as a text of terror by the feminist biblical scholar Phyllis Tribble, who teaches at Union Theological Seminary up across from the Jewish Theological Seminary. She's a very well-respected biblical scholar and has written much about terror and in the Bible, tales of terror in the Bible. So the tale itself is in fact a horrific tale of violence during the period of the Judges, and it represents one of the transitional biblical events from pre-monarchic chaos to the monarchical period. Now, unlike the transition from Moses to Joshua, the transferal of power here is hardly peaceful. Rather, this event, the narrative of the Concubine of Judea and the events that happened, lead to civil war, which among other things has the people longing for a king. So I'd like to read or tell you the narrative, and because it doesn't have enough force if I don't read it. In brief, the narrative tells of a woman who is from Bethlehem, but she lives with a Levite in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Jerusalem. Although their relationship is not entirely clear, it's not clear whether she's his wife, his concubine, his paramour. The word that's used to describe her, pilgesh, is not entirely clear, but we know that they're a couple or they're partners. It is generally thought that she was some sort of concubine or paramour. The woman deserts her partner and returns home to her father. Again, it's not exactly clear why. It's not clear whether she cheated on him, but we know that she goes home to her father. And after 4 months, her husband sets out to, as it says, woo her and win her back. She admits him to her father's house, and the father is referred to as the man's father-in-law, so that leads us to assume that they were married in some way. And the father entertains the husband for 5 days, during which time the woman is not present at all. This is just men's talk. On the way home, after 5 days, the Levite has been trying to leave, but the father has been encouraging him to stay. They finally leave, and on the way home, they turn aside to spend the night at the home of an old man in Gibeah. The text takes time to note that Gibeah is in the territory of the Benjaminites, but the man was actually from the tribe of Ephraim. Rest easy, said the old man. Let me take care of all your needs. Do not on any account spend the night in the square. So, okay. What we learn from this is how tribal, in fact, the people were at that period, and that each of the tribes had their own personalities. Each of the tribes had their own customs. In this case, there was a member of the tribe of Ephraim, which the Levite was also where the Levite lived. And he happened to find this couple and said, come spend the night in my house because it's not safe to be in the square. He was really warning them against the safety of being in the square, which we shall see was very ironic. The narrative continues. While enjoying themselves, the men of the town, a depraved lot, had gathered about the house and were pounding on the door. They called to the aged owner of the house, "Bring the man who has come to your house so that we can be intimate with him." So here they thought they were getting away from danger and seemed to walk right into it. And I'm sure one of you can tell me where you think you've read something like this before in the Bible or heard something like this before.
Sodom.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Barbara. Yes, this is very much echoing the text of Sodom, and it gives us a clue as biblical readers that this is a bad thing and that there really is evil. In lieu of the guest, the male guest, the owner of the house offers the rabble his own virgin daughter and the concubine, similar to Sodom. When the rabble still wouldn't listen, the host, or perhaps even the husband, it's not clear, threw the concubine out of the door at them. He says, "Have your pleasure of them, do what you like with them, but don't do that outrageous thing to this man." So what we have to talk about here is homosexuality and whether that was the real issue here or whether it's the violence that was the real issue here. And it's a combination of both. Essentially, this rabble or these very bad men wanted to do everything that is contrary to accepted practices in society. And so the concubine is certainly, she's throwawayable. I can't think of the word, but she ends up being the victim in all of this.
Expendable.
Thank you, expendable. So remember, of course, that the Bible is often a patriarchal book, and this is an example of a patriarchal book. The narrative continues, but the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and pushed her out to them. They raped her and abused her all night long until the morning, and they let her go when the dawn broke. We have all discussed over and over again how when something is repeated over again, and particularly in a short span of time, in a short span of a narrative, that it's emphasized. So the fact that they raped her and they abused her and it was all night long and that it was until the morning and that they didn't let her go until when the dawn broke reflects the horror of what was going on and the viciousness of what was going on. Toward the morning, the woman came back, and it was as it was growing light that she collapsed at the entrance.
What'd you hit?
I don't know. I wanted to get you on. And
What'd you hit?
where it says, when it comes on, it says soon.
Whoever,
Yes.
did you
Okay.
turn on your,
Sorry, I just wanted you to
You didn't? Okay.
I
hello,
didn't teach,
Right.
hello,
you didn't
I,
teach me. No.
Please mute everybody.
please,
Do you want to be
Wait a
on
minute.
this?
Yeah.
Mute.
But, she said mute. Am I on voice?
thank you. Okay. Toward the morning, the woman came back, and as it was growing light, she collapsed at the entrance of the man's house where her husband was. When her husband gets up in the morning, he finds his wife at the doorstep and orders her up. She is unresponsive, so he placed her on the back of his donkey, as I showed you in the other picture, and went home. When he came home, she was obviously dead, and he picked up a knife, and he took hold of the concubine, and he cut her up limb by limb into 12 parts. He sent them throughout the territory of Israel. Clearly a text of terror. Why on earth would he have done all of this? Well, perhaps people were coming to their senses, and everyone who saw it cried out, "Never had such a thing happened or been seen from the day the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt to this day. Put your mind to this, take counsel and decide." So in other words, people were finally brought to their senses by this terrible event. It is really unclear, and Amit speaks to this. Much of it is ambiguous. We don't know exactly why he cut her up into 12 parts, other than it would be one part to each tribe, and perhaps he saw the light, but we don't know things like why the host's daughter was never mentioned again, other than perhaps that it to remind us of Sodom. But what we do know is that none of the characters in this tale have names, and also we can notice that there's no mention of God. So it is I would argue that it's not a history, that it is some sort of a tale that ended up in this book, and that its purposes were political and political polemic. Now, the fact that he cut her up into 12 pieces, we will see later in the story of Saul a similar action. We're not going to talk about it today, but it is very interesting that there are many elements of the story of Saul that are presaged here. Okay, so the man is a Levite from the tribe of Benjamin, who lives in the tribe of Benjamin. He's a Levite. He's not a Benjaminite. He's a Levite. And Saul was a Benjaminite. They went to Gibeah, which in fact became the capital of Saul's kingdom. And there's this whole business with the cutting up of the woman into 12 parts that we will see replayed in a different way in the story of Saul. So keep that in mind for next week. As a result of these actions, the Israelites gather at Mitzpah, a traditional site of tribal assembly, to listen to the Levite story and plan a response to the Benjaminites. The Benjaminites refuse to hand over the guilty parties, and a cycle of violence ensues, resulting in the slaughter of many Benjaminite men, women, and children, and the slaughter of most of the inhabitants of the city of Yabesh Gilead, and the kidnapping of the young women at Shiloh, all of which are different events that happen. We don't have time to, in the last 2 chapters of the book of Judges, in response to the tale of the concubine of Gibeah. So we're clearly looking here at tribal warfare, and we can see here where Jerusalem is, where Gibeah is, where Yabesh Gilead is. So there was a tremendous civil war going on here, and tremendous unrest, and something that would not have been sustained. And as I said before, as we learn later, King Saul was a Benjaminite, and Gibeah was the first capital of Israel. Therefore, it is argued that it's a political polemic. Okay, we're now going to move on from this end of this terrible, horrible end of the book of Judges to the beginning of the book of Samuel. And the beginning of the book of Samuel teaches us about Eli, who was a priest, the high priest, and his sons. So Eli is also described not just as a priest, but as a judge. And he was the priest in Shiloh, which was essentially the theological center during the late part of the pre-monarchic period. And this tale is another example of a clear abuse of power. And so it's another example of why the system was failing. Now, what I want to point out to you is that in the very first chapter of 1 Samuel, we are talking about the story of Hannah and the birth of Samuel. I'm not going to talk about that right now. I'm going to talk about that next week because there's more of a connection between Samuel and Saul and more of a connection between Hannah and the concept of the monarchy. But I'm going to look at chapter 2 and 3 of Eli and his sons because that is more consistent with what we're talking about in terms of why there was a transition from the pre-monarchic to monarchic period. Eli had 2 sons. Their names were Hophni and Phinehas, which actually are Egyptian names. And they were introduced in the text by the epithet B'nai Belial. That is, they were introduced as scoundrels. And we know in the Bible, when people are introduced by an epithet, that definitely describes who they are and describes a lot of what's going to happen around them. Were immediately told that they paid no heed to the Lord. So Eli's sons deprived the Israelites. So here's what happened. So the Israelites would come to Shiloh and they would bring their sacrifices, just like later the people came to the temple and brought their sacrifices. And the sacrifices would be prepared in a pot. But Eli's sons deprived the Israelites of their proper sacrifice by actually stealing flesh from the sacrificial pot so that they could have raw rather than sodden meat to eat. Sorry. The public and selfish and noxious nature of their transgression is emphasized by the vivid description of the practice in the text, making clear the priests committed this transgression to all the Israelites that came to Shiloh. And here's a picture you'll see on the top left is the picture of Hophni and Phinehas getting the meat, and the bottom one is Hannah presenting Samuel to Eli. This is how the priests used to deal with the people. When anyone brought a sacrifice, the priest boy would come along with a 3-pronged fork while the meat was boiling, and he would thrust it into the cauldron or the kettle or the great pot or the small cooking pot and whatever the fork brought up, and the priest would take it away. This was the practice at Shiloh with all the Israelites who came there. But now, even before the suet was turned into smoke, the priest boy would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Hand over some meat to a roast for the priest, or he won't accept boiled meat from you, only raw." Certainly, if we were roasting meat, we would prefer raw meat than sodden meat. And if the man said to him, "Let them first turn the suet into smoke and then take as much as you want," he would reply, "No, hand it over at once, or I will take it by force." Now, inasmuch as we are not in a society where sacrifice and going up to the central worship center to sacrifice to God is our one connection to God. This was the primary connection that these people had to God. This was an order from God. This was their way of showing God that they were living up to God's rules. So it was extraordinarily important to the people that the priests perform this ritual correctly, because only through that correct performance of the ritual could they truly have their connection to God. So it was it was a tremendous abuse of power against the people. Not only did Elis Sons commit an abuse of power against the people, but their horribleness extended to the women that served at the door of the tent of meeting, or the equivalent of the sanctuary then. They would abuse the women. Again, another story of defiling women, which the fact that the two stories are in very close contact can't help but make me wonder whether the defilement of women was a symbol of the destruction of the society at that time, and something that was looked down on in the Bible. Also, it strikes me that Elis Sons just felt so empowered that they not only would act publicly in the marketplace or in the worship center, but they also felt perfectly entitled to have the women that they wanted. Almost like the ruffians who came to the house of the host in the previous story. They did the same thing. They wanted to do what they wanted with whomever they wanted to do it with. It is a tremendous example of how the society had truly fallen apart. So Eli does admonish his sons, but they ignore him, which in a society where parents are supposed to be respected by children, right? Honor your father and mother. Their ignoring of him was another symbol of societal chaos. Now, Eli was very old, consequently someone who should have been respected. When he heard that all that his sons were doing to all of Israel, and how they lay with the women who performed the tasks at the entrance of the tent of meeting, he said to them, "Why do you do these things?" Now, interestingly, we'll stop for a minute. We have to note that Eli had to hear this from it was common gossip. So it's not as if Eli was acting as the true patriarch of the family. He was absent. And he said to them, "Why do you do such things? I get evil reports about you from people on all hands. Don't, my sons. It is not favorable report I hear of the people of the Lord spreading about." So he was sensitive to the power of gossip, just as we are sensitive today to the power of social media. Quite interesting, I think. If a man sins against a man, the Lord may pardon him. But if a man offends against God, who can obtain pardon for him? But they ignored their father's plea, for the Lord was resolved that they should die. A man of God visits Eli and warns Eli. "Assuredly, declares the Lord, the God of Israel, I intended for you and your father's house to remain in my service forever. But now, declares the Lord, far be it from me. For I honor those who honor me, but those who spurn me shall be dishonored." The concept of honor and dishonor is a very important one in the Bible. It is something that I actually wrote my dissertation about. And this concept that God honors those who honor God and spurns those who dishonor God is a key one throughout the Bible. And it's also key when we're approaching a discussion of monarchy, because clearly it is very important for the people to honor the monarch. So we're getting some, again, presaging into what the society is going to become and how important honor will be in that society. The text now turns to a war with the fearsome Philistines. The impetus or the next chain of for the next chain of events and the final events preceding the transition to monarchy. So Eli is still alive at this point, but what happens is that the Philistines are a fight who truly were a fearsome tribe. They started a war against the Canaanites, the Israelites, and the Israelites, as was wont to do in those days, brought the Ark of the Covenant into the battlefield. It was not an unusual thing. God was with them. The Philistines bemoan their fate when they see the Ark, and they fear the powerful God of the Hebrews. And they refer to that God as the God who helped the Hebrews leave Egypt. So the text sort of reminds us that God's reputation was known far and wide. However, they overcome their initial fears of the powerful God of the Hebrews, and they capture the ark, and they slay Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. So now we learn of Eli's final fate. A Benjaminite ran from the battlefield and reached Shiloh the same day. His clothes were rent, and there was earth on his head. When he arrived, he found Eli sitting on a seat waiting beside the road, his heart trembling for the ark of God. So obviously, Eli was responsible for the ark. He was the keeper of the ark, and now he's very concerned about what's going to happen in the battle. And the man entered the city to spread the news, and the whole city broke out in cry. The news that being that the ark had been captured. And when Eli heard the sound of the outcry and asked, "What is the meaning of this uproar?" the man rushed over to tell Eli. Now, Eli was 98 years old. His eyes were fixed in a blind stare. Yes, clearly it's possible that the blindness that Eli suffered was as a consequence of his age. But we also know from characters in the Bible or personages in the Bible, like Isaac, that blindness is an important concept, an important characteristic for biblical characters, that it implies a sort of not just physical blindness, but a sort of emotional, intellectual, psychological blindness. So the man said to Eli, "I am the one who came from the battlefield. I have just fled the battlefield." And Eli asked, "What happened, my son?" And the bearer of the news replied, "Israel fled before the Philistines, and the troops also suffered a great slaughter. Your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backwards off the seat beside the gate. He broke his neck and died, for he was an old man and heavy. He had been a chieftain of Israel for 40 years. So, interestingly, while we're talking here about a profound theological problem, that is that the ark has been captured, we get, as we often do in the Bible, these small bits of text that make things feel more real. Eli fell backward off the seat beside the gate, broke his neck and died, for he was an old man and heavy. These little bits of biography, these little bits of description, for me, are what make biblical narratives so incredibly interesting, so incredibly human in their ways. I hope you feel the same way. Now, we also learn that Eli's daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was with child and about to give birth. When she heard the report of the ark of God was captured, and that her father-in-law and that her husband were dead, she was seized with labor pains, and she crouched down and gave birth. And as she lay dying, the woman attending her said, "Do not be afraid, for you have borne a son." But she did not respond or pay heed. She named the boy Ichabod, meaning the glory has departed from Israel, referring to the capture of the ark of God and to the death of her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, the glory is gone from Israel. She said, for the ark of God has been captured. So again, with all of the major characters we have, and with all of the battlefield scenes, and with all of the warriors, it's the woman who speaks the truth. And I am not particularly a biblical feminist, but I can't help but look at all of these different stories that we're reading, all of these different texts, and see how the woman is the one who speaks the truth. The woman is the one who saves the people. It's just very interesting. There's no logical reason why this little piece of text should be here, other than it shows that she saw the need for transition, whereas others, men, obviously were not as aware of what was going on. And she says it in such a simple fashion. The glory is gone from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. And that's the end. That's the transition. That's the very unpeaceful transition from the book of Judges, pre-monarchic Israel, to monarchic Israel, which we'll start to learn about next week. So I'm very happy to entertain comments and questions. And I just want to point out that next week we will be talking about another woman, Hannah, and the beginning of a new age, the advent of the monarchy, and the reign of Saul. And then the following week, which will be our last week, we'll talk about distinctions between the reign of Saul and the reign of David. So I'm going to unshare my screen, if I can, and see you all. Anybody have questions or comments?
I know that very few women are named in the Bible, and we never knew the name of the concubine or the wife of these two people, or, we only know a handful of women, starting with the two midwives, I think, and Eve probably. And what is the reason for that? Is it because of patriarchy, or?
I would argue it's partly because of patriarchy, but I would also argue that perhaps just there's no need for this person's name because she's speaking the truth. But more likely, I think, Rita, it's the concept of patriarchy and how it's not as necessary to have her name as it was to have her son's name, because he was the grandson of Eli. Yeah. Barbara.
I had a question about Eli rebuking his sons. And then I think you read right after that, it said it didn't matter because God was determined they would die. I was reminded that, is it Amnon or Absalom, King David's son, which says that his father never rebuked him, never said, why did you do that?
Right.
And that's why he was a bad person. But these were bad people and they were rebuked. But apparently, just like God is hardening Pharaoh's heart, he's made the decision, God made the decision these guys should die, whether they were rebuked and had a chance to change their behavior or not. I just thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, apparently so. And as I was reading that out loud, I'm thinking to myself, okay, I really don't know enough about this part of that phrase to address it properly. So I'm glad you picked it up. And it's something that I want to look at some more in terms of predestination, so to speak, of why people do what did they do, whether it was predestined or whether they had free will to not do that. So thank you for bringing that up and also for comparing it to other stories.
The reason I brought it up is that in the story of David's sons, you got the impression that if David had rebuked them, the son would not have turned out badly. And that's what I was focusing on.
Okay.
So here, Eli did rebuke that.
Yeah, but only after this had been going on for a while, and only after he heard it through the townspeople, only after he heard it through gossip, only after he heard it over tweets or whatever it was. He was not aware of it on his own. So and in fact, David, I guess, was not aware of Absalom's rebellion until he was notified by it. So I'm not sure that it would have made a difference or could have made a difference or even would have happened that he would have rebuked them. They seem to have really taken absolute power and abused it absolutely. The other point I'm sorry, go ahead, Barb.
I just said thank you.
And thank you. And the other point I wanted to make is in thinking about these terrible incidents, it occurred to me that this period in the Bible is written when mostly what's going on is war. We're not talking about the great wonders of the sea parting. We're not talking about laws. We're not talking about ethics. We're talking about wars and succeeding in war. And I think I would argue that the society had really turned and was affected by all that militarism, and the concepts of how people are to behave towards one another had really properly had really gone by the wayside. That it was really a society in chaos, and people had no respect for how other people should be treated. And I think it's a very sad time in the Bible.
A little bit like now.
Well, when in that period, you just went over, the men are all terrible. You mentioned how the women seem elevated. That's true, but also the men are no good men. It seems like at this time.
That's a good point, Andy. That's a very good point. We really don't see any heroes like Joshua.
Yeah.
Now become as I say, a militaristic, patriarchal society where people have lost respect for each other. And only when we see the introduction of Hannah, which we'll talk about next week,
Right.
do we see sort of a whole change, potential change in tone.
Right.
And I have something from Lynn here. What exactly the ark of God that is carrying? Well, I think we would say that that's the ark of God that came out of the desert and had the 10 Commandments in it. I mean, it was a central worshiping icon for the people. So whatever was in it or whatever it stood for, it was a central icon. And so by the fact that it was captured was a tremendous problem. Thanks for the question. Anybody else? All right. Well, I'm really looking forward to next week because we can show this the role that Hannah plays in this transition, and then we'll be looking at the transition to Saul, whether that's successful, whether it's not, and whether the monarchy really will resolve the chaos that Israel has fallen into. So I look forward to it. Again, thank you, everybody. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Annette.
Thank you.
Thank you, Annette.
Thanks.